More is involved here than a mere parallel between blacks and Southern whites. What is involved is a common subculture that goes back for centuries, which has encompassed everything from ways of talking to attitudes toward education, violence, and sex, and which originated not in the South, but in those parts of the British Isles from which white Southerners came. That culture long ago died out where it originated in Britain, while surviving in the American South. Then it largely died out among both white and black Southerners, while still surviving today in the poorest and worst of the urban black ghettos. It is not uncommon for a culture to survive longer where it is.
For those of y'all who are just now getting in here, man, make sure to like the video. We got Thomas Sowell. We're going over black culture, its origins, where it came from, how it came to be, you know, some of its pitfalls, some of the dangers. We going in deep today, man. So like the video if you haven't already. Grab your popcorn, grab your drink, whatever it is you like, man. We got a fire stream for y'all today. Let's do it.
Is transplanted and characteristics lost in its place of origin. The French spoken in Quebec and the Spanish spoken in Mexico contain words and phrases that have long since become archaic in France and Spain. Regional German dialects persisted among Germans living in the United States after those dialects had begun to die out in Germany itself. A scholar specializing in the history of the South has likewise noted among white Southerners archaic word forms, while another scholar has pointed out the continued use in that region of terms that were familiar at the time of the first Queen Elizabeth. The card game whist is today played almost exclusively by blacks, especially low-income blacks, though in the 18th century it was played by the British upper classes and has since then evolved into bridge. The history of the evolution of this game is indicative of a much broader pattern of cultural evolution in much more weighty things.
I don't know about y'all, but my
Southern
people's like
whites
spades.
not only spoke the English language in very different ways from whites in other regions. Their churches, their roads, their homes, their music, their education, their food, and their sex lives were all sharply different from those of other whites. The history of this redneck or cracker culture is more than a curiosity. It has contemporary significance because of its influence on the economic and social evolution of vast numbers of people, millions of blacks and whites, and its continuing influence on the lives and deaths of a residual population in America's black ghettos, which has still not completely escaped from that culture. From early in American history, foreign visitors and domestic travelers alike were struck by cultural contrasts between the white population of the South and that of the rest of the country in general, and of New England in particular. In the early 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville contrasted white Southerners with white Northerners in his classic Democracy in America, and Frederick Law Olmsted did the same later in his books about his travels through the antebellum South, notably Cotton Kingdom. De Tocqueville set a pattern when he concluded that almost all the differences which may be noticed between the Americans in the southern and in the northern states have originated in slavery. Olmsted likewise attributed the differences between white Southerners and white Northerners to the existence of slavery in the South. So did widely read antebellum Southern writer Hinton Helper, who declared that slavery, and nothing but slavery, has retarded the progress and prosperity of our portion of the Union. Just as they explained regional differences between whites by slavery, so many others in a later era would explain differences between blacks and whites nationwide by slavery. Plausible as these explanations may seem in both cases, they will not stand up under a closer scrutiny of history. It is perhaps understandable that the great overwhelming moral curse of slavery has presented a tempting causal explanation of the peculiar subculture of Southern whites, as well as that of blacks. Yet this same subculture had existed among Southern whites and their ancestors in those parts of the British Isles from which they came, long before they had ever seen a black slave. The nature of this subculture, among people who were called rednecks and crackers in Britain before they ever saw America, needs to be explored before turning to the question of its current status among ghetto blacks and how developments in the larger society have affected its evolution. Emigration from Britain, like other migrations around the world, was not random in either its origins or its destinations. Most of the Britons who migrated to colonial Massachusetts, for example, came from within a 60-mile radius of the town of Haverhill in East Anglia. The Virginia aristocracy
Okay.
came from different localities in southern and western England. Most of the common white people of the South came from the northern borderlands of England. For centuries, a no-man's land between Scotland and England, as well
And
as
if
from
you're
the
just now
Scottish
getting
Highlands.
in here, man, we got Thomas Sowell today. We getting a little history lesson with a synopsis of Black culture. So we're going to get into the origins, how some of this stuff that we came to be, some of the practices, some of the pitfalls. We're going to get into it all today. So if you're just now getting in here, double tap that screen, man. Like the video. Let's get into it.
And from Ulster County, Ireland. All these fringe areas were turbulent, if not lawless, regions,
Right now, we
where
just
none
getting a
of the
little bit of a
contending
history
forces was
lesson.
able to establish full control and create a stable order. Whether called a Celtic fringe or North Britons, these were people from outside the cultural heartland of England, as their behavior on both sides of the Atlantic showed. Before the era of modern transportation and communication, sharp regional differences were both common and persistent. In some of the counties of colonial Virginia, from nearly 3/4 to 4/5 of the people came from northern Britain, and similar proportions were found in some of the counties of Kentucky and Tennessee, as well as in parts of both the Carolinas. Although they predominated in many parts of the South, such people also had some northern enclaves in colonial America, notably western Pennsylvania, where Ulster Scots settled. What is at least equally important as where particular people settled is when they emigrated from the borderlands, Ulster, and the Scottish Highlands. Scotland in particular progressed enormously in the 18th century. The level from which it began may be indicated by the fact that a visitor to late 18th century Edinburgh found it noteworthy that its residents no longer threw sewage from their chamber pots out their windows into the street, something that passers-by had long had to be alert for, to avoid being splattered. Such crude and unsanitary living had long been characteristic of earlier times, when rural Scots lived in the same primitive shelters with their animals, and vermin abounded. A similar lack of concern with cleanliness was found among others in the borderlands of Britain, and among their descendants on the other side of the Atlantic in the antebellum South. For example, a 19th century politician built up a political machine in the poor white districts of Mississippi by such practices as this. He did not resort to any conventional tactics of kissing dirty babies, but he pleased mothers and fathers in log cabins by taking their children upon his lap and searching for red bugs, lice, and other vermin.
Yeah.
Back in the British Isles, the life of the Scottish people was transformed dramatically from the masses to the elites as they advanced from being one of the least educated to one of the most educated peoples
mutated
in
our
Europe.
DNA some, gave us
However,
some advanced technology.
what is significant here
and
is
left
that much
and
of the
dipped.
migration
Said,
to
"Hey,
the
do with that
American
what you want
South
to do with
occurred
it.
before
Don't say
these
I ain't help
sweeping
you."
social transformations. This timing was crucial, as Professor Grady McWhiney has pointed out in his book, Cracker Culture. Had the South been peopled by 19th century Scots, Welshmen, and Ulstermen, the course of Southern history would doubtless have been radically different. 19th century Scottish and Scotch-Irish immigrants did in fact fit quite comfortably into Northern American society.
We got some people piling in already, man. We just getting started on today's stream. Go ahead and like the video. Double tap the screen. It's going to be a fire stream today, man. We got Thomas Sowell. Y'all can see we getting into the Black history, Black culture, its origins, who was kind of some of the trailblazers for some of this shit. You know, how did some of these practices that we have to this day come to be? We're going to get into it, man. It's going to be a fire stream. You know, Thomas Sowell, he don't hold back. He give it to you raw, and I'm going to have some tough criticisms and opinions to follow up with. So like the video, share the video. Let's get a lot of folks in here. It's going to be a controversial stream. I'm saying it now. Some stuff might trigger y'all, but let's do it. It's going to be a fire stream. A lot of people need to see this.
Significantly, the Irish, in their Celtic ways, did not. But only a trickle of the flood of 19th century immigrants came into the South. The ancestors of the vast majority of Southerners arrived in America
Appreciate everybody in
before
the chat already, man.
Anglicization
Like
of
the video.
Scotland,
Double tap that
Wales, and
screen.
Ulster had advanced very far. In earlier centuries, Scotland was a poor and backward country, like Wales and Ireland, and like the turbulent northern borderlands of England, where the Scots and the English fought wars and committed atrocities against each other for centuries. Local feuding clans and freebooting marauders kept this region in an uproar, even when there were no military hostilities between the English and
See y'all
Scottish
having an
kingdoms.
ancient history lesson
Ulster
in the chat.
County
I'm
had a
enjoying
different
it. Keep
kind
it
of
going. Keep
turbulence,
it going.
as the
I
English
like
and
that.
Scottish
That's the type of
settlers
conversation I
there
like to be a
encountered the
part of.
hostility and terrorist
The type of
activities of the
carrying on I like
conquered,
to see.
dispossessed, and embittered indigenous Irish population. These were the parts of Britain from which most people migrated to the American South. Before the political and cultural unification of the British Isles, or the standardization of the English language. The rednecks of these regions were what one social historian has called some of the most disorderly inhabitants of a deeply disordered land. In this world of impotent laws, daily dangers, and lives that could be snuffed out at any moment, the snatching at whatever fleeting pleasures presented themselves was at least understandable. Certainly prudence and long-range planning of one's life had no such payoff in this chaotic world as in more settled and orderly societies under the protection of effective laws. Books, businesses, technology, and science were not the kinds of things likely to be promoted or admired in the world of the rednecks and crackers. Manliness, and the forceful projection of that manliness to others, and advertising of one's willingness to fight, and even to put one's life on the line, were at least plausible means of gaining whatever measure of security was possible in a lawless region and a violent time. The kinds of attitudes and cultural values produced by centuries of living under such conditions did not disappear very quickly, even when social evolution in North America slowly and almost imperceptibly created a new and different world with different objective prospects.
All right.
What the rednecks, or crackers, brought with them across the ocean was a whole constellation of attitudes, values, and behavior patterns that might have made sense in the world in which they had lived for centuries, but which would prove to be counterproductive in the world to which they were going, and counterproductive to the blacks who would live in their midst for centuries before emerging into freedom and migrating to the great urban centers of the United States, taking with them similar values.
Yeah, that's where it
The
starts.
cultural
You're not lying.
values and social
Everything from
patterns
top to
prevalent
bottom
among
that they
Southern
told
whites
us, y'all really
included
start
an aversion to
critically
work,
questioning,
proneness to violence,
critically questioning
neglect of
it.
education, sexual promiscuity, improvidence,
Yes, it is.
drunkenness, lack of entrepreneurship, reckless searches for excitement, lively music and dance, and a style of religious oratory marked by strident rhetoric, unbridled emotions, and flamboyant imagery. This oratorical style carried over into the political oratory of the region in both the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era, and has continued on into our own times among black politicians, preachers, and activists. Touchy pride, vanity, and boastful self-dramatization were also part of this redneck culture among people from regions of Britain where the civilization was the least developed. They boast and lack self-restraint, Olmsted said, after observing their descendants in the American antebellum South. While Professor Grady McWhiney's Cracker Culture is perhaps the most thorough historical study of the values and behavioral patterns of white Southerners, many other scholarly studies have turned up very similar patterns, even when they differed in some way.
We got over 100 of y'all in here already, man. It's going to be a fire stream. Let's start it off right, man. Like the video on the way in. Double tap that screen. We got Thomas Sowell. He's going to break down the origins of black culture, Ebonics. He's getting into some white history, some cracker history, as they call it. I mean, man, it's gonna be a crazy stream, and I'm gonna give my takes and my follow-ups. So be sure to like if y'all wanna, support today's stream. We appreciate the support.
As to the causes. David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed, for example, challenges the Celtic connection thesis put forth by Professor McWhiney, but shows many of the same cultural patterns among the same people, both in Britain and in the American South. Popular writings of the 19th and 20th centuries have likewise described similar behavior, including the Indianapolis residents' comments on white Southern migrants to that city, which sounds so much like what many have said about ghetto blacks. None of this is meant to claim that these patterns have remained rigidly unchanged over the centuries, or that there are literally no differences between whites and blacks in any aspects of this subculture. However, what is remarkable is how pervasive and how close the similarities have been. Centuries before black pride became a fashionable phrase, there was cracker pride, and it was very much the same kind of pride. It was not pride in any particular achievement or set of behavioral standards or moral principles adhered to. It was instead a touchiness about anything that might be even remotely construed as a personal slight, much less an insult, combined with a willingness to erupt into violence over it. New Englanders were baffled about this kind of pride among crackers. Observing such people, the Yankees could not understand what they had to feel proud about. However, this kind of pride is perhaps best illustrated by an episode reported in Professor McWhiney's Cracker Culture. When an Englishman, tired of waiting for a Southerner to start working on a house he had contracted to build, hired another man to do the job, the enraged Southerner, who considered himself dishonored, vowed, "Tomorrow morn I will come with men and 20 rifles, and I will have your life, or you shall have mine." In the vernacular of our later times, he had been dissed, and he was not going to stand for it, regardless of the consequences for himself or others. The history of the antebellum South is full of episodes showing the same pattern, whether expressed in the highly formalized duels of the aristocracy or in the no-holds-barred style of fighting called rough and tumble among the common folk, a style that included biting off ears and gouging out eyes.
Oh, shit.
It was not simply that particular isolated individuals did such things. Social approval was given to these practices, as illustrated by this episode in the antebellum South. A crowd gathered and arranged itself in an impromptu ring. The contestants were asked if they wished to fight fair or rough and tumble. When they chose rough and tumble, a roar of approval rose from the multitude. This particular fight ended with the loser's nose bitten off, his ears torn off, and both his eyes gouged out, after which the victor himself, maimed and bleeding, was chaired round the grounds to the cheers of the crowd. This rough-and-tumble style of fighting was also popular in the southern highlands of Scotland, where grabbing an opponent's testicles and attempting to castrate him by hand was also an accepted practice. Scottish Highlanders were, in centuries past, part of the Celtic fringe, or North Britons, outside the orbit of English culture, not only as it existed in England, but also in the Scottish lowlands. The Highlanders lagged far behind the Lowlanders in education and economic progress, as well as in the speaking of the English language, for Gaelic was still widely spoken by Highlanders in the 19th century, not only in Scotland itself, but also in North Carolina and in Australia, where immigrants from the Scottish Highlands were unable to communicate with English-speaking people, including Lowland Scots who had also immigrated. In the Hebrides Islands off Scotland, Gaelic had still not completely died out in the middle of the 20th century. What is important in the pride and violence patterns among rednecks and crackers was not that particular people did particular things at particular times and places, nor is it necessary to attempt to quantify such behavior. What is crucial is that violence growing out of such pride had social approval. As Professor McWhiney pointed out, men often killed and went free in the South, just as in earlier times they had in Ireland and Scotland. As one observer in the South noted, enemies would meet, exchange insults, and one would shoot the other down, professing that he had acted in self-defense because he believed the victim was armed. When such a story was told in court, in a community where it is not a strange thing for men to carry about their persons deadly weapons, each member of the jury feels that he would have done the same thing under similar circumstances, so that in condemning him, they would but condemn themselves. The actions of Southern courts often amazed outsiders, Professor McWhiney said. But what may be even more revealing of widespread attitudes were the cases that never even went to trial. As another study of white Southerners put it, to many rural Southerners, rather than a set of legal statutes, justice remained a matter of societal norms allowing for respect of property rights, individual honor, and a maximum of personal independence. Any violation of this pattern amounted to a breach.
And I don't know about y'all, man. This is, I get it. Y'all probably, if y'all new to the channel, y'all probably like, hold on, what the hell? Y'all politics, right? Well, no, we cover a little bit more than politics. We got dating, we got a podcast as well, and from time to time we'll cover a little bit of history as well, especially when it pertains to what we have going on now. And I just personally find this topic very interesting. A viewer actually put me on to Thomas Sowell. I researched some of his content. I enjoyed it, so I wanted to bring this to y'all, break it down, analyze it. Give some opinions, give some takes. So hopefully y'all are enjoying the stream. If so, man, leave a like, double tap the screen. Let's keep it going.
Of justice, requiring a specific response from the injured party.
Tuning in the chat, man.
Upon learning that a youthful neighbor had approached his wife in an overly friendly manner, Robert Lear of Tangipahoa, Louisiana, promptly tracked the young man down and killed him. Under the Piney Woods Code of Justice, anything left.
And of course, if y'all have anything y'all want to add to the stream, y'all know how S.E.T and Key Media get down, man. I'm going to go ahead and pin it in the chat just so you don't forget. But if you want to add anything to the stream, thoughts, questions, comments, super chat in $1 or more, excuse me, we got y'all. Read it aloud on stream. We got almost 200 of y'all in here. Let's keep it going.
Would have invited shame and ridicule upon the Leard family. Intensity of personal pride was connected by Olmsted with the fiend-like street fights of the South. He mentioned an episode of public murder with impunity. A gentleman of veracity, now living in the South, told me that among his friends he had once numbered 2 young men who were themselves intimate friends, till one of them, taking offense at some foolish words uttered by the other, challenges him. A large crowd assembled to see the duel, which took place on a piece of prairie ground. The combatants came armed with rifles, and at the first interchange of shots, the challenged man fell disabled by a ball in the thigh. The other, throwing down his rifle, walked